Yeah.
Well, good morning, everybody, from the Unity Museum in Seattle. It's a drizzly, rainy day, but isn't that quite appropriate to think about a day like today? It shouldn't be a sunshine day. It's a day to remember how it rained on the world way back when. Now, let me talk a little bit about why we are decided today to have me, of all people, share a little bit on the remembrance of Holocaust Day. I'm born 1942 in World War II Germany. And I guess going to share with you my own experience as a youth, maybe as a warning for all of those in the world who are considering genocide, the incredible, devastating impact it will have on the next generations, the youth, or then the following generations. As you figured out by now, I'm 81 years old, and I had many, many years following the burden of being a German youth whose parents and grandparents voted to participate in what we would call genocide, meaning us versus them. I have decided to become a certified human rights consultant because I feel it's very important that we don't just have personal opinion, but that we go with a set of articles, human rights articles that celebrate human rights, freedom of freedom, choice, freedom of discussions, and I was just talking this morning with my friend, the Unity Museum in Rwanda. Well, they've celebrated they celebrated Holocaust Day or Genocide Day all week long. Here we are today, just giving 45 minutes maybe to reflect on why we must remember genocide of any kind, whether it's Rwanda, whether it is in the Ukraine, whether it is in Germany, whether it is in so many parts of the world. That, but today is Holocaust Day, so we're going to remember Holocaust. And here we are. We have an exhibit here, and you will notice that we have Anne Frank as really the poster child for genocide for me. And let me tell you why she became a poster child for me. So, as I already shared, I'm born in 1942 in Germany. And I remember that my grandparents lived in Dresden. So that's just another part of the family story, but lived in Dresden and fled as refugees from Dresden to North Germany, which is where I was born. But my father and mother lived at that time in North Germany. And my father was an engineer who became the inventor of the first baby cars here in the world. So he was an engineer. And he then was hired by building German airplanes for the war. And so we moved to Bremerhaven. And Bremerhaven at that time was really prior to my youth. Here you have Bremerhaven. Looks very much like Ukraine, looks very much like Palestine and the Gaza, looks very much like many places in the world that experience genocide. So admittedly, as a 3, 4-year-old, I probably didn't have all that much of a memory, except my memory goes something like this. My mother waking me up in the middle of the night. We had a baby brother in her arms, and we ran into the cellar. And I was scared because she ran, and I didn't understand really what was going on. But I was frightened because I would trip down the stairs, and my mother would try and hang on to me, and the curtains close the cellar. Were closed to keep it dark, and it's where we had our coal bin and our potato bin, and here we are, freezing cold in the middle of the night. And for me, when I looked at the curtains drawn, the blankets on the window, it looked like a firework out there. It wasn't really until the next day that I realized those were life bombs coming down on my city. Now, as a youth at 5, 6 year old, we would go out and play outside amongst bombs in mom's bombed out city. And I remember we would go treasure hunting. The naivete of a child that copes around a situation that you don't have really any say over. It is what it is. So I remember going into one of the bombed out houses and I found this beautiful uh, vase. And I brought it back to my mother and said, "Look, Mom, look what I found. It's such a beautiful vase." And she said, "Where did you find it?" I told her, the bombed out house, 2 houses away from us. And she says, "You bring it back right away. This doesn't belong to you. This belongs to somebody else. They will come back. It is rightfully theirs." It was my first lesson in realizing that there was a new set of ethical behaviors amongst each other. It reminds me of another day when, we were, just to share with you, my upbringing at that time was starving. We had very little food. It was mostly vegetable and water. And my grandmother made soup for us. And on weekends, we had a piece of meat in there and bread. And here comes the story of that last piece of bread. I'm just telling you what it's like to be a child that survives war or genocide and what the reality on the ground, what it looks like. So there was my mother and my grandmother and the three of us, and we would have soup. And one day when I first started the museum in Bellevue, a Russian lady came in with her grandson. And she said to me, remember, I'm German, she's Russian. She says to me, "My grandson doesn't believe the story of the bread, the piece of bread. Can you tell him what this is all about?" I knew right away what she meant. Of course, I knew it right away. So I sat down, Grandma and the son, and this is what I shared because it was just like my own house would sit down at a dinner table. We had soup, and there were pieces of bread. And if there's a piece of bread left over, and we were always hungry. I remember my entire youth in Germany, I was always hungry. And there was this piece of bread. Now, my grandmother wouldn't take that last piece of bread because she had a daughter and children there starving. My mother wouldn't take that piece of bread because she had 3 children sitting there. So we had to have rules. Who was going to get that last piece of bread? It was me one day, being the eldest daughter, then my brother next week, and then my brother next week. And then the three of us decided it should go to Grandma. And then the week after that to my mother. And when I shared that story, that little boy next to that Russian lady in Bellevue, right here in the state of Washington, in 2013, to be exact, 11 years ago. And he looked at his grandma and said, "Wow, your story is true, Grandma." And I looked at him and I looked at her, and we both almost cried because nobody would believe you today, these stories. You're a youth, Cameron. And when we hear these stories, I was starving. Yeah, but do you really meet somebody that was going through it? Or is this just documentaries on television? Is that the real life agenda? And so that last piece of bread is a very real story. For many, I see these children right now in the Gaza Strip running and no food. I know what's going on. I know. Because one day my mother sent me to the molkerei, which is to get some milk. That's where the dairy was. And I went there to get some milk in my little can and some butter. And on the way back, I looked at the butter. And wow, I was just dying to have a piece of that butter. So I dipped my finger into the butter And I tried to cover it up and smooth it up, and I gave it to my grandmother at home. And she looked at the piece of butter, and she could see I had dipped my finger into the butter. And she looked at me and she said, I know that's really what you were wanting to have a taste of. But do you know that you also took it away from your brothers, your mother, and your grandmother? How did it make you feel knowing that you took it away from them? I've never forgotten that. I felt it so shameful. How could I, when we're all starving, feel I was entitled to dip my finger in the butter? Because she had plans for the butter, for the bread, maybe to bake a little something for us. And so I learned very early, 6, 7, 8 years old, I learned very early the consequences of starvation. Now, I want to go back to the day, because this is Holocaust Day. One day in school, so I went to school, right? And I noticed there were mostly women teachers, because the German men, were in Russia, in the camps and in various places. My grandmother's sons were in the Pacific War, and my uncle was in Italy in the war. My stepfather was 13 years old in the war, 13, under Rommel in the tanker unit in Africa. And then my family lived in Dresden. So my upbringing was very much in the middle of horror stories, whether it was from my grandmother about her son being in the Pacific, or my stepfather, being in under Rommel in Africa. These stories are part of my youth and my upbringing. And I remember one day in school, two memories. First of all, one of the memories in school was, here we were, and a lot of our families didn't have fathers at home because they were in prisoner of war camps. But every so often, as a young student or a schoolmate would say, "Oh my God, Daddy walked in last night." And we all looked at them, and we didn't dare ask, but we wondered, and sometimes we did ask, and sometimes we didn't ask. What's missing? You wonder, what do you mean, what's missing? Daddy walked maybe from Russia, walked all the way to Nordenham by then. I was in school in Nordenham. We had left Bremerhaven because of the bombing. And what's missing is a leg missing? Is an arm missing? Is part of the face missing? What's missing? And then the child would say, or our room buddies would say, oh, an arm. Or, well, he only has one leg and he was walking on crutches home. And we all knew the suffering that this family, surviving this terrible youth of ours, it was part of our youth, and it was part of our upbringing. So I remember one day saying to my mother and my grandmother, because Anne Frank's diary arrived in my school. Today is Holocaust Day. Anne Frank's diary changed my life, because I asked my mother and my grandmother, how could you vote for him? And she said to me, can I have that Life magazine that we have laying somewhere? Thank you, Cameron. And my grandmother said to me, Sabine, Grandpa served in World War I in Turkey. When he came home from Turkey Germany was pretty well devastated after World War One. And thank you, Carmen, you got it. Here we go. Right? And no, I meant the World War One that we had right out there, Cameron. I'm sorry. There's a Life magazine right there. Okay, I'll come back. Yeah, that's a. So my grandfather came back from Turkey after having served, in World War One, and she said to me, and then came this man, and he built autobahns, and everybody was working, and televisions and radio. There was hope for our family. We didn't know what is about to happen. We weren't aware of that. We were just lucky we could feed our family again. There was work. And so I remember listening to her, and my mother and my grandmother were pretty serious and sincere that we didn't know. And the question is, but did they? So in my hometown, in Bremen, in Nordenham, well, it was pretty far removed from Poland and the concentration camps. But my grandmother said, and my mother said, but there was a jeweler in town. And one day the jeweler was closed. And we wondered, maybe he went on vacation. And we were sort of hush hush talking about that, what was going on, because we knew there was something that just wasn't right. But in my hometown, there was no trains and pickup of people and trains leaving Nordenham to go to Auschwitz. So I feel that my family took the position, we're surviving in Nordenham, and Auschwitz and the concentration camps were quite a way away. And so in that survival mode, it was sort of an unspoken crime, genocide. Now, I then became obviously a child who then experienced the aftermath of the rightly deserved. How do you stop a country that is killing millions of people? Us versus them. I just want to make a brief comment, because many years later, in '69, I became a Baha'i in Hawaii, because we believe the earth is but one country and all of mankind are its citizens. We are one. It's not us versus them. It is unacceptable. And I embrace that. But let me share with you. So my youth, I graduated from high school in Germany. And my mother decided that I should go to England. So I became an au pair. And I spoke sufficient English, just a little bit of English, right? So I arrived in London after the war, after Kristallnacht and all that, right? So I decided, because I had a bit of a youthful chip on my shoulder, and I said to my mother, I'm going to stay with a Jewish family in England. And my grandmother said, I'm glad you are, Sabine, because it will become part of your upbringing, your culture, and the consequences. And it did indeed become that. I stayed with a Jewish family who was so kind to me, were so overwhelmingly embracing to me. And they had a little 2-year-old. And I was the au pair that took care of the little 2-year-old. Well, it was the 2-year-old's birthday. And so we had about 15 people over for a lunch, a brunch, so to speak. And being the au pair, I would serve tea and some of the refreshments. And we didn't have tea in the middle of the room, so I made it in the kitchen, and I would bring it in to give it to everybody, right? And so I asked everybody, do you want cream and sugar? And everybody told me cream and sugar. And by the time I went back to the kitchen, I forgot half who wanted cream and who wanted sugar. So I go back um, into the room. I said, I'm so sorry. I said, I forgot. And there were three people I forgot. Did you want cream and sugar? And all of a sudden, the entire room shunned me. And here I am, 16, just by too few days, 17, pretty young. And not even in my own language, everybody spoke English. And everybody shunned me. And I looked at everybody. I thought, oh, my English is not good enough. So I asked again, did you want cream sugar? And they all shunned me. So to be honest, I became a bit scared. And I thought I'd done something terrible, not thinking really. And I backed out and I went to the kitchen. I said, Mrs. Pulver, I said, I did something terrible wrong. Nobody is looking at me or talking to me. She says, oh, Sabina, it's not your fault. All my au pairs in the past were from Scandinavia. They just found out you were from Germany. And these are Holocaust survivors. And I remember my grandmother and my mother and sharing with you that you will be the generation who will experience the aftermath of what we had caused. And I stood there and I said to her, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. She says, well, Sabina, go into your room and I don't think we need you anymore today, and just sort of be quiet and until I tell you to come back out. And I sat in my room and I'm thinking, this is so terrible. This is so real, so palatable. So here I am sitting in the middle of Holocaust survivors, and they're looking at me, and they can barely stand to even. It was a perfect response was to be shunned. So I know what it's like to be shunned. It happened to me on several more occasions later in life, but I also knew as a German youth, being born in that era, it is what went with being a German that was a youth coming out of that era. So Mrs. Pulver the next day was very sorry. She had a boutique, and I helped her sort of in her boutique. And she said to me, Sabina, she says, I want you to come with me when I go shopping tomorrow. I said, okay. She says, but when we go into the store, I want you to just observe, not to say anything, not be a teenager that suddenly wants to, She said, just be quiet and just observe. So the next day, then we went to a butcher and a baker. That's all I'm going to talk about because there was much more to that. But first, we went to the baker. And I noticed when she and I went to the bakery that she would stand in the back of the store. And the store was quite full. But I noticed that more and more housewives were coming in to buy their bread. But finally, and they were all taken care of before her, finally the store was empty. And she said to me, and then she no, and she stepped forward and she said, I'd like to have that loaf over there. And he said to her, I'm sorry, that loaf is spoken for, but I have a day old loaf if you would like to have that. And she says, yes, thank you, sir. I would appreciate that. And she purchased the day old loaf. And I just observed what had just occurred. Then we went into the butcher shop. And the same thing, once again, we went to the back of the store and we waited until everybody was gone. And then she was offered day old or 2 days or 3 day old meat. And then we would, go home. And she sat me down and she said to me, hate is everywhere. Your country in Germany took it to a Holocaust that the rest of the world, pray to God, will learn from that. She says, but in England, here I am a businesswoman like everybody else. And when I go shopping, you observed in person what it was like to be a Jew in England. And then, of course, we know that the boat of Holocaust survivors who went to the coast of America were sent back home again. So, being a child that learned, first of all, that hunger is just what goes with war, having no clothes, you know what it's like when my grandmother sewed my school clothes from curtains and tablecloths. We couldn't go out and buy clothes. And we got one pair of shoes at the beginning of the school year. But my school was 4 kilometers away and I walked. And you know what happens when you're a teenager? You grow, and I was sort of tall at that time. Then your shoes, you outgrow your shoes, but you still walk to school. And you still come home and you then just take off your shoes because your toes are all squished in, and sometimes they'll be bleeding. But that's the aftermath of war. Shoes don't fit. You don't have clothes, you don't have shoes. But I don't think I ever thought about it very much in my upbringing in Germany because everybody suffered this, everyone my age, my youth, everybody suffered the same way. So we didn't go, oh, poor victim me. We just said, oh, we survived. And our fathers came back home and our mothers survived. Sometimes I wonder, I've got a lot of energy I'm sort of accused of. And I wonder, after I had a terrible diet growing up and it was mostly water and soup, and there was nothing balanced about that. But my grandmother had a vegetable garden and we survived because of our vegetable garden, and periodically we were able to get a piece of meat. So I look back on and Frank, and we've all watched all week, I have anyway, stories of true Holocaust survivors, what it was like to be in a concentration camp. Just last night, I listened to it on TV, on PBS, and I'm going, what these children went through that arrived in Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei. Really? Really? This is what happens when you brainwash the citizens, of those who jumped off the trains. Some of them lost their lives. Some of them survived jumping off the train. And I'm listening last night to Dr. What is the name of the book again she wrote? Your mom just bought it. Anyway, we'll come back to it. And I listened to her from a child's perspective, how it was like, how she knew the severity and she was dancing for a gobble, and what it took every day to survive. Nobody in her family but her and her sister survived, but those two survived. Eventually, she made it to the United States. Eventually, she got married. And a few years ago, one day, her daughter found this book in the attic that depicted life in the life as a survivor. All these pictures of inside Auschwitz, and she went down to her mother, and actually to her father, and she said to her father, "Why do we have this book?" And he says, "Well, your mother is a survivor," and she had no idea. Then she finally had the courage to ask her mother, "Is that you're a survivor?" She had no idea. And the mother finally decided, yes, she would talk to it. And her mother, after having been traumatized and hidden and being ashamed that how she grew up was in those circumstances, the family decision was made that she would go back to Auschwitz. And this was her moment. of taking a look how far she had come, how far she survived. And then she decided to go back, get her PhD, just like her daughter. And she then discussed survival of trauma and became this amazing, wonderful counselor to deal with survival of trauma, Vietnam vets and the likes, right? And I'm listening to that, and I'm saying to myself, look how long it took for her to survive, because Anne Frank didn't survive. But Anne Frank became for me my pivot. It could have been me. I was her age. It could have been me. You know, Anne Frank's the same age of Martin Luther King and Walters, Barbara Walters. It could have been me if I had a different background. Now, my family last name was Herzfeld, a very Jewish name. And of course, being my family being survivor of Dresden, a very Jewish name. And we, as kids at home, during my upbringing, we said, I bet you we had German ancestry, because when my mother got married to my father, she had to prove that she wasn't Jewish. And my brothers and I going, see, she had to prove she wasn't Jewish. And then they'd prove that they weren't Jewish. And I bet you they figured out how to cover it up. And about 2 years ago, I got my DNA test. I said, this is it. I have to know, was I Jewish or not, even if it was 1%. And my DNA came back, zip zero, not even 1% Jewish. But my entire life, until I was in my late 70s, I always thought there was a part of me, because of my last name, Kaufman, very Jewish, Herzfeld, very Jewish. So I always felt that I was sort of a bit of a Jew that didn't suffer the consequences. But apparently, I was 90% Scandinavian and some British and some Viking. So there you have it. Okay. But being German, really, that being of the generation that was the cause of genocide, of the Holocaust, and Anne Frank allowing me as a peer to recognize it could have been me, allowed me then, in my case, by becoming a Baha'i, where we feel the earth is but one country and we are equal, or in spite of religion, in spite of race, in spite of economic or gender, in spite of everything, we all must be treated equal. And that is why, can you hand that to me? Declaration. And that's why I got myself certified and a consultant to talk about human rights. And so this morning, I was talking to my friend, Ladislav, in Rwanda. They celebrate Human Rights Day, Holocaust Day all week long. And we have a Unity Museum in Rwanda. We have a Unity Museum in Cameroon. We have a Unity Museum in Portland and in Buffalo, New York. And we're working on Detroit and Lansing and various other cities, even though some of them are just traveling museum. That means they have an exhibit like this. And then they tell the story of human rights and unity of all of mankind, the humanity, the oneness of humanity, right? So I was talking to my friend Ladislav, and I said to him, he was the one that encouraged me. He said, Sabina, please talk about your experience as a youth, because I'm talking with my youth here on genocide in Rwanda. And it is so hard. And they kind of began to remove themselves because Rwanda became an IT capital. And so Rwanda actually became quite well off. He says, but we have a lot of youth that are going into gangs. And I started with Ernest, I started a football soccer team. It's called Soccer for Peace. And when I saw your project and the Unity Museum saying Uniting Youth for World Peace, that's us. That's our soccer team for peace. And we wanted to become part of your project that was actually launched by our Japanese youth who felt we should do something with all these students that we have here in the museum, that we got 4,000 visitors, but we should walk the walk, not talk the talk, right? And so I said, well, how? And she said, well, how about if we go global with Uniting Youth for World Peace? And she gets into her iPad and she types it up. And I said, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm launching Uniting Youth for World Peace. And I said, well, let me see it first. And I looked at it and we edited it. And we went live on Facebook. And within just a few days, somebody came back and said, Gumbaya, Gumbaya, Uniting Youth for World Peace. You know better than all of those people who are marching the street, Gumbaya, peace, but nothing ever happens. And then I said, talk to them. And I said, well, what are your service projects? How are you making it happen at the grassroots where you are? And so we came up with 10 service projects on our Facebook, Uniting Youth for World Peace. And one of them is to become a consultant for human rights. And that is when I did that and I posted it. And when we then posted the 10 service projects, wherever you are in the world, whether it's Ghana, whether it's Kenya, whether it's South Africa, whether it is in Azerbaijan, whether it is in Israel, whether it is in the Gaza, whether it is in Germany, in Canada, in Hawaii, or Vietnam. And so we then went public, and this is where suddenly other human rights consultants saw us and became and wanted to have a traveling Unity Museum. That was very exciting. But let me also go just a little bit back more into my background story. So then eventually I left, I got married to a wonderful Englishman, Michael, and his friends all told him I was just marrying him for his passport, and he was making a terrible mistake, and you know how those Germans are. Anyway, so we decided to leave England and went to Canada and eventually ended up in Hawaii. And when I was in Hawaii, after a few years, I had a sense of, once I was a Baha'i, I had a sense I wanted to do some service work. And eventually I brought 300 children from orphanages around the world into the United States. But I went out with medical supplies and I went to first Romania. That was in the middle of war. So here I arrived with all my medical supplies and toys for some of the orphanages. And I was ducking in and out of shops because the panzers were still running in the street. And the taxi driver that picked me up in Bucharest drove me past the capital where Ceausescu and his wife were just shot. The blood was still, on the on the wall. And I realized here I was again, years later now, again in a war zone. But now I was in somewhat familiar territories, and I went up to Cluj and I visited at that time, some of the Baha'is there. And I was working with an OBGYN, and the devastation in Romania was just unspeakable. But I was familiar with that scene of hiding in cellars and no food. And then I marched forward and I got back on the plane and I went to Vietnam. Getting into Vietnam, that time there was no U.S. embassy. So Cherry Clark, who had been working with orphanages way back before the war broke out in Vietnam, who was now in India, helped me get a humanitarian visa to get into Vietnam. And I had sort of got some permission from my own governing body called the Universal of Justice to be very cautious, diplomatic, and not to do anything that would hurt anybody, because right there at that time the Baha'is were in concentration camps. But so I went to Vietnam, and I worked with the orphanages, and I brought some sustenance to the orphanage, as I did in India, as I did in Vietnam. And Vietnam had just gone through, the Vietnamese in the south, where I was in the beginning, Ho Chi Minh City. They were in starvation. They were in and barely feeding each other. It was my youth. I got it. I was right within my who I grew up. I got it. I understood it. They understood me, that I got it, and I understood them. We didn't have to explain anything. We didn't have to be embarrassed about anything. We didn't have to feel ashamed. But eventually, I did bring some children from the orphanages home and sponsored some of the friends that were there in concentration camps during that time, who visited me not too long ago. And eventually, the National Assembly of Vietnam eventually wrote up the history of Hanoi. And it so happened that I was in Hanoi with my late husband, who collapsed in Hanoi. And it's a very long and a very sad story, but I was able to medevac him out. But his doctor and his her husband, who was also a physician, and their children became Baha'is, because we thought JT was dying and Hale was with us, who was helping to translate for us, and we were basically sleeping on the hospital floor. And that kind of opened up the community. And so,
I was gonna grab that book.
Thank you. Okay.
You have it at home, I guess.
Oh, so eventually, we leave a tiny ripple, a tiny mark behind. Wherever you go, wherever you are, you've got to remember, especially when you're out on a pioneering post, you've got to remember, and this is when I want to talk a little bit about The Hague. 1918. Well, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, Baha'u'llah, wrote to the kings and rulers in the 1860s to get all the leaders together and form a body of leaders that will treat their citizens peacefully and stand against war. And that didn't happen. The only one that responded favorably was Queen Victoria. And she said, well, if it's of God, it will survive. And then eventually he passed away, and he was exiled from Persia to Israel and to Mount Carmel, and is buried there. But eventually then his son took over, and he came to the United States and America in 1912. And he talked about warning Europe about the breakout of World War I. But nobody listens, right? That was in 1912. Nobody was listening. But he talked a lot about women's rights and anti-slavery and the topic of race and materialism. And sure enough, when he went back home, he felt his trip was a failure, because nobody really believed that World War I was imminent. And then when actually in the war, it was Abdu'l Baha in Israel had cornfields. And when the military came up from Africa, and the British military was very devastated, and he fed them because he had cornfields. And he helped them to survive, where in the end, the British colony knighted him for his service. So even though you can be a prisoner, as he was, well, he had just been released at that point, obviously in 1901, '09. But even when you always need to find a way, regardless whether you're Cameron's age today, who's just getting his master's degree in psychology, and he's studying human rights and human frailties and human survivor, right, Cameron? And so I'll hand you something over in a minute. And poor Cameron didn't know he's going to be in on this. And I decided that we should have the youth in my generation together because we don't know where we're going. Really? We got a pandemic globally. We've got wars in several places of the world. We are potentially in World War III. We got so many human rights violations in motion that I feel it is potentially Cameron's generation that's going to end up, or his generation, next generation, end up where I started off when I was born and grew up in an aftermath that really right now we have no idea what we're going to be looking at. We really don't know. And our museum really concentrates on human rights, on climate, on genocide, on gender equality, and on race, because all of those are causes for genocide. And so this us versus them is unacceptable. And as a global citizen, we all have to join hands and have especially our project, Uniting Youth for World Peace. And so, Cameron, if you can say something, your experience of having been with us now for how long?
What, like,
The
yeah,
Unity Museum?
right. 10 years.
So, therefore, share with us what your experience as a young person to talk about human rights and our opportunity in the museum. What do we actually service? In which way do we service our visitors coming in, and how do we talk to them? And what do you do? What is kind of your role in here? Look at the camera.
To have conversations and give everybody the opportunity to not only express themselves with regarding whatever they're experiencing with all the
Homelessness.
that's what I was thinking, because you just walk up the street and you see half a dozen people just standing around,
Surrounded by homelessness. So what do? Right? So we have a wonderful lady, Shirley Ballard, and she knits all the caps for us. So it's winter now. So we give
yeah,
up.
that's why people come here, is to look for solutions. And
There you go.
so all of a sudden they're like, okay, I don't know what to do about homelessness, and it's just awful out there. And so they're sitting there like, how do I keep myself from being homeless? Because it can happen pretty fast, right? Just 1 month. Most people live month to month. Or
Day to day. Yeah.
that's right.
And I think the part that I like about us at the museum here, when they come in for a cup of coffee and for a safe place for an hour or so, and then, it's time to face the street again. But we feel, and we've been kind of called a safe place, and the word has gotten out because we look into the eye. We listen to what is going on in their life. And they come back because they trust us, that we don't profile them, that
Well,
we're all
everywhere else
equal.
you go, you need to right up front. If you don't fork it over, then then you're out of, then you don't have a place to be.
Yeah.
You got to get out.
So we're a pace of
And even then, it's not like anybody talks to you. They just like, try to be nice and get a tip.
yeah. So at the Unity Museum, as you can tell, we're not only, even though it's Holocaust Day today, but many of the homeless die on a daily basis too. And so the Unity Museum respects every condition. And as I shared with you that Anne Frank was really my pivot in my life when her diary came out. And and so we all have what I call maybe our Anne Frank moment, our moment when we say, how can we make a difference? We have to leave our mark behind that becomes, even in a tiny, small way, like I would love to, and I'm looking forward to talk to the soccer kids in Rwanda very shortly, and they're going to be seeing this video because I want youth to know there's hope for everybody. You will survive, but you must learn from that survival experience. So therefore, I want to say goodbye. Come and check us out at unitymuseum.org. And thank you for giving us an opportunity to be with you. And thank you, Cameron, for setting this up and helping with the technology to make this happen. Because this exhibit behind us goes on the street every day. So therefore, we have it upstairs today, but usually we figured out we have an exposure of a little over 1 million people, one way or another, that are looking at our street signs or social media because we're right behind light rail that lets out about 12 to 14,000 people a day, 72,000 students across the
You
street.
got the sandwich board sign right by the exit, and then there's
Thousands of people. And so, therefore, we like to encourage you to maybe in your city have a traveling museum like this one here, where you can take then traveling walking tours and tell your story in your neighborhood on Earth Day or on Women's Right Day or Holocaust Day. There's so many different UN days. And with that, we like to sign off. And thank you, Cameron, for being here and being my right arm and being the wind under my wings. And goodbye, everybody.